It is said that when Jesus was born, heaven and earth rejoiced. Like the planet sang. And when he was a child, Jesus was so connected to God that he found safety in the stillness of the synagogue. It was home for him. It was his Father's home. And we don't know much about what happened to Jesus after that for, boy, a good 20, 30 years or so. But some people think that he went to Asia to study Buddhism because he suddenly appeared as if out of nowhere in his early 30s, sharing these new ways of looking at the world and how to live in connection with each other. It was a way that hadn't really been known in that part of the world before. And the people that Jesus walked and worked and lived among really loved him and really loved his teachings. But, there were a few religious and political leaders that felt threatened by him because he questioned their authority, as good teachers do. They wanted him gone, and they executed him one Friday, then put his body in a cave and covered the opening to that cave with a huge stone so that it would be a tomb. Now, there are 4 different stories of what happened the following Sunday morning, and this is just one of them, and it comes from the Gospel of Luke in the Christian Testament. It was early dawn, and some of the women who loved and learned from Jesus went to the cave to clean his body and bless it, anoint it with spices and oils. That was the tradition in Judea 2,000 years ago. When they got to the cave, they were shocked by what they saw. The stone put at the opening had been moved aside. So silently, fearfully, they went into the cave. They were nervous. They were really afraid. But then they were completely stunned, shocked, because Jesus' body was gone. Who would take his body? And suddenly, 2 angels appeared, and they were in brilliant white robes, and they were so dazzling with light that they lit up the cave. And the women fell to the ground. They were petrified. They were scared before, now they were petrified. So the angels asked them as gently as they could, "Why are you looking in the tomb for someone who is alive? He's gone. Don't you remember what he told you back in Galilee? He told you that he would be handed over to the Romans and executed, but that he would come back after 2 days' time. Remember? Remember he told you that?" And all at once, the women remembered that Jesus had told them he'd be back. He told them, and even though they'd listened, they were so stricken by grief on Friday and Saturday that they had just forgotten. So suddenly, their fear was a little lessened, and they ran back to tell the other disciples, the other students of Jesus. And they told them what happened. Now, in this story, the disciples never actually saw Jesus again in person. But every year, Christians celebrate this morning, Easter, because though he may have died in body, he isn't really gone. Now, that story could mean a lot of different things, but here's what it means to me. We live on, even after we die, in the hearts and minds and memories of the people who love us. And the work we do in the world, especially when it benefits others, lives on forever. Sorry, that distracted me for a second there. Do you know what a mashup is? Like, folks with gray hair like me may not know what a mashup is. It's when you take two songs and you put them together, like one verse of this and one verse of that. My favorite one is a mashup between a Scissor Sisters song and an old Leo Sayer song from the 70s. You make me feel like dancing and I don't feel like dancing. It's totally schizophrenic. Now the thing about pop culture is we have this funny way of doing this, of mixing things together like that, because they make us feel simultaneously comforted by the familiar and extremely clever. And the thing is, we do it with everything, including religious stories. Now, the Christmas story is a perfect example of that. The Gospels have 4 very different narratives about the birth of Jesus, but we've sort of blended them all into one. Like it's hard to even tell them apart anymore. And so we've created this one story that is complete with a manger and stables and animals and angels and wise men and a star. And then we've added some pre-existing pagan rituals to kind of act as the glue that binds it all together. And we've done the same thing with the story of the death of Jesus. You know, the 4 Gospels tell very, very different stories. Now, Matthew tells the story of Mary Magdalene and someone he calls the other Mary, who could have been any number of Marys named in the Bible. And they go together to clean and anoint the body. And in this telling, there's been an earthquake after the crucifixion. But it was actually an angel who moved the stone from the mouth of the cave, not the trembler. And the angel said to the Marys, "Don't be afraid." Then they saw Jesus, like somehow they're looking at the angel, but then they see Jesus and they fall to his feet, and he gets them up and he says to them, "Don't be afraid. Go and tell the other disciples I'm here, just as I have said I would be." But in this story, Roman guards see what has happened, and they get bribed into saying that they saw the disciples steal the body, which throws everything into chaos. Nothing goes according to plan. And in the Gospel of Luke, the one I shared earlier, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and someone named Joanna arrive at the already open tomb, and there are 2 angels, but no Jesus. Again, they get the "don't be afraid" reminder. They run back to the others and recount their experience. Now, Mary, the mother of Jesus, absolutely believes them, but none of the men do. And Peter goes to the tomb, and he finds nothing there but bandages. Still, though, he doesn't really believe them. He wonders what really happened. Now, in Mark, the women are named as Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. En route, and I find this like, is Joanna supposed to be Salome? Is she like a different translation of Salome? I don't know. But en route, they're really worried about how they're going to move that stone. And of course, when they arrive, they find it already moved. And inside, there's this young man standing in the corner. Now, just a regular guy. He turns out to be a very low drama, low illumination angel. And he just tells them that Jesus has risen. No explanation. And they run away so disturbed by this average guy in this cave saying he's an angel that they never say a word about the incident to anyone. Now, John's gospel, I think, is the most interesting. Mary Magdalene visits the tomb before sunrise. She sees the stone moved, and in fear of just the moving of that stone, she runs back to find Peter and someone called the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. And the 2 men race to the tomb and find it empty, but there on the floor are the bandages and the washcloth that was on his face, neatly folded.
And it starts to sink in the memory that Jesus told them that he would rise. So they just go home. Now, the man who loved Jesus, neatly folded linens, sounds kind of gay to me. And it sounds kind of gay to a lot of people. So we don't talk about that part. But the part we do talk about is how Mary Magdalene goes back later and encounters two of those, well-lit, electrifying angels and asks them about Jesus, then turns around and sees Jesus standing there. And he doesn't have to identify himself. I mean, he has to identify himself because she doesn't recognize him. And he tells her, "Don't cling to me. Just go tell the rest of the disciples that I am about to ascend to our Father the way I said I would." And then later, Jesus shows up where all the disciples are, and he just says, "Peace be with you." Very chill, very Venice, California. And then he puts up his stigmata hands and points to the wounds to prove his identity, to prove that he is in fact the guy who was crucified 2 days earlier. And he says, "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." Then he breathes on them and he gives them the power to forgive, the authority to forgive, like officially forgive. So 4 different tellings of the resurrection story. Now, honestly, this is why I find it amazing that there are people who claim to take the Bible literally. I mean, really, this is one event and it's told 4 different ways with 4 very different sets of facts and full of contradictions. But the thing I find really interesting about these 4 stories is that the only things they have in common are Sunday morning, the stone rolled away from the mouth of the tomb, and women showing up. The women who loved and followed Jesus, his mother, his friends, his students, his family. He'd spent his ministry engaging with women in pretty remarkable ways that were even revolutionary for their time. He taught them and he learned from them. He listened to them. He believed their stories. He healed them. He empowered them to heal. He treated women like they were people and not just the property of men, not just chattel. So can you imagine what it must have been like for them that morning? I bet that they were thinking that with him gone, everything would just go back to the way they had always been. They would be powerless in a world where men had all the money and made all of the decisions. Even as they took on the task that was always assigned to women in those days, caring for the bodies of the dead, I can't imagine they wanted for a second to return to the way things were before this teacher arrived and saw them for who they really were. In all 4 stories, these women are either doubted or framed for a crime. It's not surprising that in one of the stories they would just keep silent. I would probably keep silent if I were in their shoes. And nevertheless, they persisted. They became teachers. They became priests. And women who came after them also persisted. As a little sect of Judaism grew into this thing called Christianity, women were leading alongside men. When the faithful gathered in home churches and in graveyards to recreate the ritual of the Last Supper, women were often the leaders. They were the priests who turned the act of sharing bread and wine into the ritual that today is called the Eucharist or the Holy Communion. Women were a huge part of the formation of Christianity. And they were so much a part of it that Paul, one of the architects of Christianity, the guy who basically wrote the manual for building Christian communities, In all those letters to the Galatians and the Thessalonians and the Corinthians and all those others, admonished early Christians, telling them to take away from women the authority to perform priestly duties, like celebrating communion and forgiving sins. And we know that women were doing this because he was telling them not to. He wouldn't have said it if they weren't doing it. Now, Paul was known as an apostle, but he was not a disciple of Christ. He never knew Jesus, but he is credited with introducing the idea that only men could be priests, because Jesus was created in the likeness of God, and men as priests operate in the likeness of Jesus. And to this day, that is the main argument for keeping women out of the ministry in many Christian traditions, not just Catholicism. But it's not like that in Unitarian Universalism. You know, Friday was the 15th anniversary of my ordination by the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco. I was working at the time in a street ministry called the Faithful Fools, which was affiliated with that congregation. And the ceremony of ordination included stilt-walking clowns, jugglers, nuns dressed in crazy outfits, a queer Lutheran preacher, a self-ordained street mystic, and people of every gender expression you can imagine. We sang a song by Eric Bibb called God's Kingdom. Whether Eric Bibb intended it or not, the song is an expression of really traditional Universalist values. That God loves everyone, no exceptions, and no hell. My favorite verse from the song is, "Women teach the men folk how to forgive. Peace is the way. We gotta walk our talk and teach our children every day." And that's how women have persisted in ministry outside of Unitarian Universalism, whether it's ordained ministry or lay ministry. Women have persisted by forgiving. And in this little UU congregation, home of the Sisterhood of Getting It Done, that's the work that continues. Forgiving, teaching peace, walking the talk. And maybe that's the work of Easter. Through song and word and just sitting and facing each other, we forgive, despite the doubt, persisting. Please rise now, as you're willing and able, for hymn number 268, Jesus Christ is Risen Today, an Hallelujah song.